Hi there, welcome to Threatpost Now. I'm your host, Paul Roberts. I'm an editor at threatpost.com, Kaspersky Labs security news blog. We're here to talk to you today about security in the education marketplace. Schools have ended and students have gone home, but the job for IT security professionals working in the education marketplace is 24/7. And today we've got three great guests here to talk to us about their work securing schools and universities. And let me introduce them now. To my left, David Escalante from Boston College.
Hi, Paul.
Go ahead. David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm the Director of Computer Policy and Security at Boston College, and we have a fairly large campus between 10 and 16,000 students, about 70 buildings, and on a given school day there are 10,000 plus devices in the network. We've got a variety of devices on our network, from computers to handhelds to supercomputer clusters and things like that, doing research and teaching and learning and hosting various things for parties on the internet.
Great. Josh?
I'm Joshua Corman. I'm the Research Director for Enterprise Security at an analyst firm called the 451 Group. I'm a bit of a reluctant analyst, but I'm trying to keep our models and our perceptions of the threat landscape, technology landscape, and how to secure enterprises a little unconventional.
Steve?
Steve Mazzola, Director of Technology for the Belmont Public Schools. And we have 6 buildings, 6 schools, administration, and we have 4,000 students and about 500 staff on our network.
Great. Now, all of you have been working in the IT security space in one way or another for quite a few years. Give us a sense how your job and the work that you do and the security challenges you've faced have changed in the last 5 or 6 years.
I think that my environment hasn't changed so much. 5 or 6 years ago, there were portable phones, and the first smartphones were out, and people had laptops and things like that. There are more mobile devices, and there are more laptops, and there are more Macintoshes than there used to be. But so the mix has changed, but not the overall situation. In terms of what I spend my time on, though, I think that's changed a bit because we're spending a lot more time on compliance efforts and on massaging all of the data that we're collecting that we weren't collecting before.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think that when I look at the job, I don't think that, we still have the nuts and bolts. We still have to deliver services. We still have our customers, which are our students and parents. But interestingly, as we've moved ahead and things have gotten more complicated with the same amount of staff, the one thing that I see that has really kind of overshadowed a lot of things in the last 5 years is the idea that projects that we put forward now must have a discrete security component to it. Previously, if Active Directory was working, if we had the account set up right, great. But now you can't do that anymore. You need to have an environment where that is an integral part of your planning and your budgeting as well.
Right. And Josh, you were at IBM before you came on to 451 Group, so obviously you can talk about this in some depth as well. How do you see the threat landscape and the security landscape changing?
So, change is constant and turbulent in IT security, and some of these things are evergreen. They're as old as the earth, but the frequency and impact seem to be magnified. So typically the CISOs I would work with, whether they were small, medium business, educational, government, what have you, there's really 5 sources of constant turbulent change. We see threat and adversary landscape change. We'd see the compliance and regulatory landscape. It's interesting you brought that up. That's really eclipsed risk management for our time and energy. We see technology changes like virtualization and cloud computing and mobile devices. Economic changes, I'm sure no one feels those right now, and then business changes too, so the priorities of the business and stakeholders change. And the confluence of those has made our job increasingly difficult. What we have is an unbound problem with very bound and flat budgets and staffs. Mm-hmm. So it's forcing us, I think, to prioritize where we focus our efforts. Right now in the last year, I'd say massive changes in the threat landscape. And we're seeing a breach a week this year in 2011. It's not just your traditional attackers either. We went from thinking it was just glory and ego to organized crime. But last year revealed state-sponsored actors. So this is heavy stakes, international in scope. And recently we've seen the rise of the chaotic actor, which is really these hacktivists or ideologically fueled chaotic actors like Anonymous or LulzSec, which may in fact be students in our school systems, even in the high school level. So it's the notion that we have more attackers and more diverse attackers, which should fundamentally change our assumptions about our risk models and our assumptions about who would attack us, how, where, and why.
Both of you, all three of you, talked about the regulatory environment as well. Many people might think of regulations like PCI or Sarbanes-Oxley as primarily private sector concerns, but in fact schools, universities are also wrestling with that problem. Give us a sense of what is on your radar when it comes to the regulations that you're bound by and how those are affecting the work that you do.
Well, a big university ends up having its fingers in an awful lot of pies that, if you think about it, it might make sense but surprise people on the face of it. So big universities end up actually being financial institutions by dint of the fact that they make loans to people. And the ones with hospitals that are associated with teaching end up having to deal with HIPAA issues. If you take credit cards in your dining halls or your athletic venues or wherever, you end up having to deal with PCI. Institutions in Massachusetts have to deal with the Massachusetts data breach list, so it just goes on and on and on, and there isn't really much you escape from a regulatory perspective because universities do so many different things.
Right.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that really the focus for us this year is the PCI compliance on the state regulations. It's taking a huge amount of time, mainly because we're an institution that previously we do certain things, we have certain levels of compliance, but until it was codified, you don't really understand where your holes are.
Right.
And so to make it so that we can look at those holes, understand what they are, and to comply is a 2-year challenge for us, which we've started. And the other thing that overlays all this is, that was mentioned before, was the expense. We can do this, we can understand it, we can do it to the best of our ability, but to tack on an extra $100,000 to not a significant budget to begin with is incredible. Lastly, really getting people together to understand that this is something that has to be done. You have to remember, in an educational standpoint, from an institutional standpoint, we educate students. Security is not our primary focus.
Right.
So to bring people along, even though they're very willing and they kind of understand the reason why we're doing it, bringing them along and diverting them from their normal day-to-day duties is a task. It's a big one.
These are kind of unfunded mandates in some ways that you need to comply to. In other words, the requirements are there, but there is no budget that goes along with compliance.
Yeah, it's really just the last in a history. If you look at No Child Left Behind, I think Belmont got maybe $1,500 last year,
right,
for compliance.
Right.
For No Child Left Behind.
Right. So 4,000 students, $1,500.
Yeah. State requirements for reporting requirements, right. And yes, there was no money set aside for that.
So this is a great topic to say this, but I created a stir last year in the security world when I compared PCI, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, to the No Child Left Behind Act for IT security. And the point was, we were so focused on the negligent merchants who had done nothing to secure cardholder data that we defined a minimum, and everyone raced towards that minimum.
Right.
So in a cash-strapped economy, what we saw were possible best practices from 2003 being touted as impenetrable best practices for everyone.
The gold standard.
Yeah,
right.
the gold standard got hacked and slashed budgets. And I just did a talk called Why Zombies Love PCI, or the No Zombie Left Behind Act for IT security. And in it, what we're trying to point out is, even if those had been effective in 2003, what we're seeing is zombies don't want what's in your wallets. They want what's in your brain. So they're after our research at the universities, our IP, or our secrets. And it's doing a very, very poor job. So I empathize with cash-strapped organizations in the educational field because we're being forced to do things that aren't even necessarily effective anymore.
What would you guys say is the biggest security threat facing your organizations today? Obviously, David and Steve, if you had to pick one.
I think one of the biggest problems we have today has moved from the technological things to educating our staff and our students and people like that about how to deal with threats that are targeted at them rather than at their machines. So that's been a big problem. It's not that there aren't still attacks on machines, but social engineering has become much more of a lever than it was a few years ago, where it's become much more smooth and effective.
Okay. Social engineering, the practice of kind of hacking people or using targeted emails or even phone calls to get sensitive information, useful information out of employees, students, and what have you. Steve?
You know, it's interesting, if you had asked that question a couple of years ago, kind of the image that comes to mind is a student with a laptop sitting in a dark corner somewhere on the network and trying to hack in, but that's really not it. I have to agree wholeheartedly that the shift has moved, and recently we've had this experience of targeted phishing, and regardless of the amount of education that we do need to do more. Granted, there are still folks who continue to click on links and things like that. So we've definitely shifted our focus away from the traditional, what you view in the movies of some kid hacking into this type of issue.
Josh?
It's good to hear the confirmation, but there's a great book called The New School of Information Security, and the chapter often referred to said amateurs study cryptography, professionals study economics, and recently I've been changing that to amateur attackers study reverse engineering, professionals study social engineering. There's a fantastic podcast, social-engineering.org, which is really bringing to light that although we've always known there's no patch for human stupidity, it is the easiest and most reliable attack surface. And then maybe as we've gotten better at the easy compliance things, they've risen to applications and people.
That's
right.
Mm-hmm. And certainly if you look back at what, obviously legendary hackers like Kevin Mitnick have been talking about all along, and look at, particularly his MO, a big component of that was social engineering. I mean, obviously, a very smart guy technically, but social engineering played a huge role in his attacks on various companies. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, we're going to dig a little bit deeper about the human security problem and patching humans, and go on and talk about some other really interesting things about education and security market today. Welcome back to Threatpost Now. I'm your host, Paul Roberts, editor at Threatpost.com, Kaspersky Labs security news blog. We're here today talking about security in the education market. With me on the show today, David Escalante, who is the Chief Security Officer at Boston College, Joshua Corman, who is the Research Director in the Enterprise Security Practice at the 451 Group, and Steve Mazzola, who is joining us from Belmont, Massachusetts, where he's the Director of Technology in the Belmont Public School System. Gentlemen, welcome back. So before we broke, we were talking about social engineering attacks, patching humans, as it were, and how social engineering attacks have really become, for you guys, a major concern in the work that you do, a major vector of attack. David, maybe start by talking to us about the types of social engineering attacks that you're seeing in the wild, kind of out there targeting employees, students at Boston College.
Well, we see a variety of things. We see the scare types of things, all of the scares for people in college are sometimes more interesting than the ones you get at home. Like there was the classic one of, I'm going to post this picture that I took of you at the party over the weekend. If you should click on the link and make sure it's okay.
Yes, okay.
There are a surprisingly large number of students who apparently need to look at those pictures of what they were doing at the party.
Yeah. Reason to be concerned, I guess, right?
It's plausible.
Right, but also we've had highly directive things toward our management that have said things like your wire transfer didn't go through, please look at this PDF, or here's a subpoena, please look at the PDF, that's specifically targeted at higher education management, trying to get them to open things up that end up exploiting vulnerabilities in certain Adobe products, for example.
Potentially coming from trusted sources or addresses that they might recognize, or not necessarily, just more about the context?
Semi-trusted. The cute thing about the things I illustrated is as long as it looks like it's coming from a law firm, or if it looks like it's coming from some financial entity, then it's less important that you actually have the absolute trusted source like some name. But we also run into the regular Spanish prisoner thing, I'm stuck in London and I need a ticket home, and all that kind of thing too.
Right. Steve, anything much different in the K-12 market?
Similar, but we don't get nearly as much probably at BC. But we do get a fair number, considering that upwards to probably 97% of our traffic is spam or some related email. Then some get through, and yeah, we get people who click on what looks to be very realistic looking items, some purporting to be from the IT department, even though at the beginning of the year we tell everyone that we will never ask for their passwords, the story.
Right.
But a few do. But one promising note is that even with this rise of these types of emails, the good thing is that I think the awareness has risen on parts of the staff, because they're reading it in the newspapers, they're seeing it on television. So it's made actually our job a little bit easier, that when I do say, oh, this is phishing or this is something, they say, oh yeah, I kind of know what that is. And
right.
So they do a first pass at it.
And Josh, social engineering attacks aren't anything new. They've been around for years. Why all of a sudden is everybody talking about them? Why all of a sudden is it an acute problem as opposed to just part of the background of the online security world?
There's probably a number of reasons. I will say one thing that has changed dramatically is the users are volunteering a tremendous amount of actionable information through social networking.
Right.
We have things like Facebook or MySpace, I guess is obscure now, but
not if you have a band.
Not if you have a band. So Foursquare, for example, just perplexes me. We spent years concerned that we don't want the government tracking our every movement, and now we're voluntarily declaring it everywhere we go to say I'm mayor of somewhere, who cares? So the advantage goes to adversaries who can leverage this, who are incredibly well crafted and targeted. Now with students, it's a little easier to say you did something compromising last night, so that's a great example. I think it's just easy and reliable, and it's going to continue to be used as long as it is effective.
Are we seeing a refinement in the sophistication of the attacks?
Well, it's going to depend on who the adversary is and who the targets are. So the students, that's interesting. That's usually they want to hijack their computer for botnet participation, maybe to steal some credit card info, but it's much easier to steal vaults. In the university environment, I'd be far more concerned about perhaps someone trying to get at some research material or some intellectual property through some joint sponsored project. There's a lot of labs in these universities, and they're very attractive targets as someone who wants intellectual property or secrets or technology advantage. So it's really important to model what do we have that's replaceable, mm-hmm. what do we have that's irreplaceable, and points on that continuum. Mm-hmm. And you want to put the most sufficient dose of protection on the things that you really can't afford to have compromised.
Right.
Oh, I think it ties in nicely with what he was saying earlier about them trying to get data and things in your mind and research and things like that, right? If it's no longer we're trying to compromise a computer in the school district because we want to compromise computers and launch a DDoS attack or something or other. They're
right.
trying to actually get information, and if you're trying to get information, what better way to do it than to get users who work with that information to provide you with something, be it a password or a lever into their computer or something like that.
And one of the unique assets in education is the students themselves. When I was in the X-Force, we had a colleague look at the Russian mafia and the Chinese military recruiting U.S. students in undergrad programs and offering them a second paycheck if they simply share all the data and projects they work on for their first 2 years of their career. So how do you like to pay off your student loans and not know that you actually may be compromising your economy or your national security? But it was an incredibly effective ploy to turn assets out of students, especially at good engineering schools.
Scary stuff. Sort of gave the students plausible deniability. I don't know what they're doing with the information, but I just know I'm getting a second paycheck. Interesting. One of the things that's always struck me about the education space, in particular from a security standpoint, that is particularly challenging is the incredible amount of churn in user populations that you all, David, Steve, deal with on a not only year-to-year basis, but actually semester-to-semester basis, where you have these huge shifts in the population, incoming students with new machines that need to be secured, students leaving with, presumably with access to your network that you need to cut off. And I would imagine that poses a unique security challenge. How do you address it?
Well, I think for students, it's different on the K-12 obviously than it would be on the higher ed level. But the students really, they're here and they go. There's not students staying to do research maybe, or staying for other purposes. So it's pretty clear cut that we have a start date and an end date for accounts, and that's it, and they're wiped out, they're done with. For staff, however, we do a reasonably good job of hiring staff and bringing them in and getting them with their accounts, but I think we don't do such a great job of when a staff person either changes status, maybe they're going to be in a different school or something, or if they leave service, they retire, they're terminated, whatever it may be. That process is where the concern is because, as you say, it could be currently, or last year was that a staff member could leave and we may not get notified by HR for weeks, maybe months later. And it's all usually in one big letter. We get all the names. Whereas we need to know about people that leave mid-year, why they left, change in status. So what we've done is we've developed a tool which is opposite our intake form. We have basically a change of status form, which allows, it's generated by HR. It's done right when the status changes, and we get it first. So it's a really nice tool for us to be able to track those changes.
We have a range of automated systems that have been developed over years in higher education to deal with that, because if you think of a traditional four-year college, and there are a lot of students in higher education who are in a traditional four-year college, but you're talking about 25% of the people graduating every year and a new 25% freshmen coming in. So it is a very big churn, and the same thing happens, I would guess, in your high school, if you just view it that way. So one thing that we've tried to do is segregate the network somewhat so that we can treat the area that we put the students on as sort of untrusted, because we have new students coming in and there are too many to train right away. They bought their computers at home over the summer. We don't really know when they bought their computers at home over the summer what they've done with them before they get them into our campus. So we don't want to just put them in with everybody else. And there's also a set of software typically called network registration, which was sort of a precursor to network admission control. It's been used in higher education for years to track those students and figure out who they are. So ultimately, if we ask them to, say, install some security software, since we're talking about that sort of thing, since we have a network registration system and there's a back end, hopefully, to a managed security program, you can compare the list of people who are in the network registration system to the list of people who have checked into the security system and say, hey, some of these people didn't check in, and then start to go after them and try to manage it that way.
Right. Josh?
So it's very interesting and pleasing to hear there were some process answers here, and that we had the holy trinity of people, process, technology. And I always say, whoever said that was brilliant to put people and process first and technology last. But typically, like good crack addicts, we go straight for technology and security. We do. And really,
shiny objects, right?
When you look at the adversaries and their changes, those are externalities outside of our control. But what we can control is the infrastructure choices we make. We can control the process to tighten and manage and transition through change. And change is opportunity, but it's also risk. So these are good approaches within our sphere of control of how to maybe reduce the entropy, reduce the attack surface.
And these aren't changes, these aren't problems rather that are actually unique to education. I mean, certainly hearing Steve talk about offboarding folks and privilege management, role management, even for folks who are changing roles internally. These are problems that private sector companies are having as well.
Yes, they are. I think the frequency is probably higher in these, but same thing in retail. You have temporary employees at Christmas time. You might have high turnover rates and low-paying jobs. So it's nothing new under the sun. It's just about your frequency and impact.
Right. One of the big challenges is that the IT security spending market has been quite constrained in recent years. Obviously, with big economic downturn, Steve, at the local level, municipal level, it's been huge shocks there in terms of amount of budget available, cuts in state aid, cuts in federal aid. And also, David, at the university level, obviously they've been impacted as well. Has that affected the work that you do and the amount of or the resources that you have to spend on security? Does security kind of go up or down on that priority list depending on budget?
Oh, absolutely.
Does it go up or does it go down?
In my case, Boston College has always been very generous about supporting the security program. There were a couple of public incidents at Boston College close to 10 years ago that caused the administration to realize it was important to support, but certainly things have been constrained in the last several years with the economy, because we were trying to shift monies to support students who needed more financial aid as opposed to investing in infrastructure, because we thought that was what was important.
No, I think that certainly we've taken, at least over the last 3 years, have taken a substantial hit. However, my philosophy is that we do infrastructure and we do security first as best we can in terms of spending. Of course, that has limits, and then everything else comes after that. Mainly because, one is you can't really afford to have 3 years of not having at least any equipment purchases, because then you're so far behind. It's tough to make that up. And then also on the security end, as the field changes so quickly, things atrophy very quickly, more than the equipment does. And so I'm not saying that we spend huge amounts of money on it, but what I'm saying is at least when we do spend it, we try to spend it wisely in that area.
Right. I mean, as you said, we're in, and David, it's true of you as well, we're in the business of educating students. We're not in the business of securing infrastructure. So obviously our technology spending needs to support our core mission, and yet, you can't totally ignore the security problem either, or you're gonna end up with some unwelcome surprises, I would guess.
And I think David brings up a good point, is that much like the trustees would step up and say, I think we need to be spending more in this area. I think the Belmont School Committee in the past 2 years has really recognized that this is kind of our lifeblood, and we can't do much without our infrastructure and our security. And so for them to be behind that, it was really critical to moving forward.
And to Josh's point, since we were talking about some of the difficulties of social engineering as a big issue, that's not one of those things where you go buy some big expensive box and it fixes social engineering. Maybe you can talk about people process technology again, but sometimes having more budget isn't necessarily what makes you more secure.
Right. Although the alternative, the fix of social engineering might be user education, which is not buying boxes, but also can be expensive to realize.
In the private sector, in large enterprises, we saw spending with, I call it a security tax, right? So how much is the tax you need to do? So for every $100 you spend on IT, which percentage of that should be security? And it rose from maybe 4% of an annual budget to 12% in a matter of a couple of years. And pretty much that was fueled by the fact we were doing our risk management however we were doing it, and we added on an unfunded mandate for compliance, times as many as affected you, in your case several. I like that rule of thumb that maybe just to manage expectations in budget cycles, figuring out what is, as a percentage of our budget, a healthy security quotient or risk quotient. And what you end up finding is if you act economically, certain IT choices will make it much more expensive or less expensive to do aftermarket security. So people are doing smart things like virtualized desktops instead of traditional OSs, because they can cut down on IT costs and they can do some more security things they might not have been able to do otherwise. So in school districts where there's much scarcity in budget as compared to a Fortune 1000 or a Fortune 100, they need to be far more economic. So in some ways they have a harder time with much less funding, but an easier time because they're forced to scrutinize not more spending but better spending.
We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, it's going to be a busy session. We're going to talk about advanced threats. I want to talk about the future security landscape, which would include mobile devices, wireless devices, as well as Josh mentioned virtualization. So we've got a great conversation coming up, and please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Threatpost Now. I'm your host, Paul Roberts. We're talking today about security in the education marketplace. We have three experts with us who have been giving us a real good rundown of security issues facing K through 12 school systems as well as universities. David Escalante from Boston College, Joshua Corman, an analyst at the 451 Group, Steve Mazzola, who's the IT director in the Belmont Public Schools in Belmont, Massachusetts. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you.
Great. One of the things we've been writing about at Threatpost quite a bit in the last year is kind of two parallel trends, both similar. One is the advent of advanced persistent threats, or APTs, targeted attacks against organizations, some in a defense industrial base, government agencies, and large-scale corporations like Google. The other is even more recent, a rise in kind of hacktivist or anarchic online activity by groups like Anonymous and LulzSec that have compromised a large number of organizations, both private and public sector, Sony, Monsanto, as well as the FBI, PBS, and others. So this has become a huge trend in recent months. What do you guys, how does this affect the work that you do, if at all? What is your take on these types of, many of them high-profile attacks, many of them super sophisticated? Is this an issue for schools and universities, something that you're paying attention to?
It's something that we're paying attention to, but at least in my experience, the attacks are perhaps blossoming, but these sort of threats have been there before. I think Boston College's website was defaced probably sometime around like the year 2000. Wasn't there like defacement.org or something? There was actually some website where you hacked into things and posted how you had broken in and stuff. So, I mean, this stuff is not new. It's certainly a higher profile, and there have been some issues with big companies before, but we've been facing some of these issues for an extended period of time.
I think it's dangerous. I can appreciate the perspective that it's not new, but I think this is a very serious development. So it's almost like bell bottoms are back in style. So yes, there is a little bit of this malfeasance.
They are back in style?
Well, the chaotic actor, so to speak, the defacements are back. But I think the real issue here is, as we said before, compliance is really perpetuating and codifying maybe stale best practices. If they were ever best, I think they're good practice. I'd like to see what better and best look like. I think what's happened is those were predicated on the assumption of a casual, unskilled attacker who's going to try one thing. If they fail, they'll move on to someone else. The APT is a horribly distorted term. You've written quite a bit about it. As you know, I like to call it an adaptive persistent adversary.
Okay, you've written even more about it.
I've written a lot about it. In fact, I think we made a free report on the adversary. But it's not a what, it's a who and a how. It's a methodology. It's mostly, the defining characteristic is persistence and more stealth. They know you're compliant and they do not care. In many cases, they're counting on it. And that's what we saw with the RSA compromise, Lockheed, et cetera. A different parallel stream, to your point, is the rise of the chaotic actor. So it's not new, but we actually saw that diminish. And now we're seeing groups like Anonymous, LulzSec, and other derivatives where it's really an ideologically fueled attack. So in the past, I might steal from Sony if I'm an attacker, but now we had 18 plus individual compromises as part of a punishment campaign. So these chaotic actors are less predictable, more tenacious, more persistent, more merciless, and they may affect different targets differently.
And Steve, I would guess K through 12 school system, probably not something that is top of mind for you, but who knows?
Well, you don't know, and that's part of the whole security discussion. Is one thing that you think you're maybe not involved with or immune from or protected from. You can name the whole list over the years. Then all of a sudden you are.
Right.
So we don't try to take anything for granted, but it's on the lower scale for us at this point.
There's some high school age participants in some of these, so it may not be that you'd be a victim, but it may be. No, we're not going to get there yet. But part of the people process solution is, if this is an ideological thing or personal power play thing, it may be necessary for us as educators to get to the possible hacktivists and talk about security or crime or responsible use of internet or whatnot before people start participating in these and head down a path they maybe shouldn't.
Right.
They think it's maybe like some of these romanticize about it and think they're being Robin Hood, chaotic good, but in many cases they're turning into the Joker from Batman, chaotic evil.
Right.
Right. I mean, there's certainly been a huge change in terms of, if you start with your area and then go through mine, it's like K through 16. Some number of years ago, when you went to college, that's when you sort of got a computer and or got an email account. And now you get it, what, in grade school?
Right.
So some of the, where do you educate someone and where do you start trying to imbue them with the right philosophy toward approaching technology and security and stuff has moved way, way, way in Steve's direction.
Right.
By the time they get to us.
Right, and one of the things that we've seen is that in the case of anonymous is, as Josh said, they're promoting free tools, for example, doing denial of service attacks. Young people will download these in the sort of fit of passion, use them, and often those are the people who have actually been arrested and by authorities, because of course it's very easy to trace this particular computer on this cable modem account was used in a denial of service attack, even though this person is clearly a foot soldier in what is a much more sophisticated organization.
It's almost like the drug campaigns when we were growing up and whatnot. It's people may think that they're helping to protest against some corrupt company or corrupt government, but oftentimes those are distraction, cover fire for the same group to do something more serious, more targeted, more illegal. So often they're weapons of mass distraction, and you're going to be a disposable sacrificial lamb to the nucleus of these groups.
Right. And Steve and Dave, it strikes me that a big part of your job often is keeping your students, the students who are under your care, from doing things that are self-evidently stupid. But that they might be inclined to do anyway. Obviously, the MPAA and RIAA have been had very intense dealings with the universities and some K through 12 districts as well around ripping musics and movies and redistributing them. How do you manage that part of your job?
Well, I think education is really the core here. This year, we rewrote our student acceptable use policy, and historically, student acceptable use policies have been, you shall not do this, and there's a whole list. And by the way, we still have that in there. But we added a section this year, and that's around digital citizenship, and explaining to the students that you should honor copyright. You should not destroy other people's data. There's 12 items. It goes to e-commerce, security, and that was just kind of the core document that we started working on. And then you have the media services, when they talk about doing research, they explain to students that what you do affects others. When you're doing research, you take other people's work, that affects others. So, as David kind of said, hopefully we're the feeding grounds for when they'll have some sense of that they are a citizen in the digital world when they get to a Boston College or some other institution.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought.
I think that it's always an interesting challenge with someone of school age to try to balance out what's right and what's wrong, and when you want to see us and when you don't. We're almost like policemen.
Right.
If you're doing something that's maybe a little wrong and it's against the rule and you're not supposed to be doing it, you don't want to see the policeman. If your car breaks down in the middle of a scary dark woods in the middle of the night and the policeman comes by and helps you, you're delighted to see a policeman, or someone's doing something bad to you. So it's a sort of a tough call, but in general we try to work with students and help them understand that we're there to protect them, and we're trying to make them understand how to protect themselves and work better in this environment, as opposed to be someone who's trying to stop them from doing things.
Right. Well, one of the big changes, kind of the elephant in the living room of most IT organizations these days, is that you have an increasing population of devices, like smartphones, tablet PCs, and other devices that you have really only a limited amount of control over, and yet do affect your environment, are devices that you need to be aware of and manage. How are you guys, students are early and enthusiastic tech adopters, how is this affecting your day-to-day job?
They usually want support for these devices. The support that they get from the big box store or the wireless carrier or whatever isn't necessarily what they need. And it's another set of operating systems for us to support, essentially, so it becomes difficult in that area.
Security issue at this point?
There's sort of yes, there's a security issue. I mean, when companies develop these mobile devices and push them out on the market, they don't apparently spend lots of time and money with version 1 on security. They're pushing it out as a consumer device, and if it takes in the market, you see over several revisions that they add the security in. And you've seen this with iPhones, you've seen it with Androids, it just goes on and on and on. So the problem is there's a new device, it's hot, people want it, and it's insecure. And I don't see that changing because of the dynamics of the broader market.
Nobody's not going to buy the iPhone because they're concerned about security issues with it.
Right. So we tend more to be saying keep that data off of the device,
Right.
which may or may not work, but it's not really clear what else you can do if the big consumer companies are going to push this out to people.
Right. Now, Steve, in K-12, it's a even more fraught situation. First of all, because you historically, managing your IT environment has really been about managing the systems on your own network. Now you've got students with iPhones, potentially iPads, other smart devices. They're connecting to a 3G network that you don't have any real say over in terms of blocking what content they have access to. And then there are issues such as cyberbullying and so on that these devices can really enable. How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, right, exactly. And, well, they could connect to our open network as well.
Right, and they can connect to your wireless network, right. But then they've got to go through your proxy.
They do.
Yeah.
So, the issue, I think I have a little bit of an advantage over higher ed, and that is that these students typically, when they're in a classroom, they're under some modicum of control with either their teachers or department heads or principal. So in that environment where we say you cannot bring your smartphones or fill in the blank, you can't bring that into the classroom, then that cuts off. They don't even bring it. A lot of them don't even bring it to the school. Mm-hmm. They may use it for when they have a free period or something to use it. And that's deliberate. We have no policy for the use of iPads or tablets that are not part of our network, and that's deliberate on my part. I need to see where the market's going a little more. I know some of my colleagues have embraced it, and I think it's been okay for them, but I still have this concern that having these devices come in an unsecure manner is just not where we want to be.
I think, if you look back, the IT security industry is about 25 years old, give or take. It's still pretty nascent, and for the first epoch or whatever, we really spent most of our time and money protecting infrastructure, the networks and the systems upon which we did our jobs. And I think what we're seeing is, as a forcing function with social media and these consumer devices and trends like people bringing their own devices to work or to school, we can't control the IT infrastructure, and it's forcing our sphere of control to possibly the more important things like the applications we run, the data we need to protect, and the people who interface with both. So maybe we always should have been more focused on people and data and the applications that access that, and maybe now this is the chance to do so. The other thing is about the education here. Since the bullying, it was a great example, cyberbullying, you might be able to prevent it on the school systems, but when they go home, they're going to do it anyhow. So for this to be to transcend individual devices and get to the root of the problems, one of the ways the education is thrown around is through policy. But I think if we look at the demographic, we need to make this relevant, accessible, and something they would digest and embrace. That's why we do things like zombies. That's why we talk about social media like Twitter and engage them on their level, because if you can make security personal, how do I protect myself or my information or keep my systems clean and running? Then selfishly, they'll educate themselves, be more skeptical, and also potentially you've turned 4,000 or 16,000 potential weaknesses into 16,000 potential security devices.
It's an excellent thought. I guess, we're here, you're talking to potentially your colleagues out there in the education marketplace. If you had a piece of advice to give them just in closing about, where to put their priorities or their energies with security, what to do, maybe do or think differently now than they've done before. This might be an opportunity to talk about zombies, Josh. What would you suggest?
Well, I think one thing that, at least in the K-12 level, that we have a tendency to do is sometimes we get a little too comfortable with our operation, and security tends to get pushed off and is not forefront. And frankly, security is maybe is handled by 2 or 3 people, and just for reasons of just staffing. So I think my own personal bit of advice, and one that I have to keep reminding myself on, is that we need others, particularly the K-12 market, outside experts, to come in and say, hey, you're not doing this so well. You got to clean up your act. And that's critically important, because they're not going to allow us to stay comfortable. And that's important here. Not everyone wants to be told in a report that you're not doing it well, but I'd rather be told that than not know?
I think my call to action or my advice for any organization, any industry here, is we have more to unlearn before we go to try to educate. So simply broadcasting things that aren't necessarily working anymore, we have to look at this as a complex adaptive system. This is more like game theory than it is like preventing auto accidents. You know, there are uncontrolled and uncontrollable variables here. So I'm really trying to get people to use 2011 as a re-education year and stop assuming that the things that worked potentially in 2003 continue to. So this is why I'm trying to do aggressive things like the zombie stuff. So for step one, watch the zombie video that we've linked to. But also, since we can't scale to these attackers and their budgets, we have to start buying more rugged and defensible infrastructure to begin with and manage it in tenable and sustainable ways. And there's an organization called Rugged Software at ruggedsoftware.org.
Which you helped found.
Which we helped found. And the idea here is, as a buyer of infrastructure, you want to get something that is where you have a fighting chance. So take a look at that as well.
I think one of the things that's annoyed me is there's been an increasing amount of cooperation on the side of the bad guys over the past few years, and there hasn't been an equal amount of cooperation on the side of the people who are trying to defend themselves.
Right.
So if there are a group of people who are trying to attack us collaboratively whilst we're defending ourselves singly, that's probably not where you want to be. Even if you're buying a product from a vendor or something like that, if you're implementing it by yourself, that's not good. So at least in the higher education space, there are a couple of groups that are trying to fight that and make sure that people work together. The ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center for Higher Education, is very active and good. It's called REN ISAC, Research and Education Network, ISAC. And you should consider joining that. Actually, you shouldn't consider, you should join that if you're in the higher education space, and you can, because there's a lot of useful information. We're actually starting to share attack information, so if somebody attacks school A, it gets passed to other schools so that they don't get attacked in the same way and don't know what's going on and things like that. And I don't think a lot of businesses are quite even to that level yet. And the other thing is the EDUCAUSE group has produced an information security guide that could be used by anyone in education or outside of education. It has a vast array of information. It's based on the ISO standards, 1799, 27002 in terms of structure and organization. But it's got best practices for all different areas of security. It's got examples from different higher education institutions that you can actually directly go to and see what they did and model on what they've done and stuff like that. So that's an excellent resource to be able to do something. Even if you don't have budget or you don't know where to start, you can go and say, oh, this is what other people did. It's all organized for me. Off I go.
Right. That's excellent advice. I mean, so often our response to attacks is very siloed. You know, we look at our own organization, our own employees, our own customers, rather than saying, oh, well, you know, this is actually a community or a social problem that affects all of us, right? Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And I hope to have you guys back sometime soon. This has been great. Well,
Thanks,
thank you for joining us. This has been Threatpost Now, and we are the security publication, threatpost.com, the security blog of Kaspersky Lab. I'm your host, Paul Roberts. Stay tuned. We're going to be back with more episodes of Threatpost Now coming to you in the months ahead, and we're going to be taking on different topics. It was education today, but we're going to broaden out from there. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to having you back. Thank you.